invite me on to chat to you all about this today. So, like Dave said, I've been working really closely with yourself, Graham, and some others on the ground in NRW to produce GIS-based maps, so Geographical Information System maps, of the whole of the NRW estate in one click. So, I say one click, it's not quite one click, but it is using existing data. So, our aim is just to hopefully get a little bit of feedback from you today about how we've done it, perhaps how you might use it within your organisations, and with the hope that it might make all of our lives a little bit easier. So I'm going to go through 4 really brief bits really. So the traditional methods, how we're using existing data, how we're categorising the sites, and the use of the GIS. So a lot of us will be familiar with colouring pencils, highlighters. I mean, hands up if you've got a map in your office which is coloured in or has been coloured in, or whether you use, has anyone got that? Or so it's great, and sometimes that way is the best way. However, if there is an easier way to do it, potentially, we could explore that. Some people have gone down the right lines of using a designer, so it's a halfway house between using GIS and the colouring pencils. And what we're trying to do is create these kind of maps, but on an automated basis. So we're using existing data that we've got within our organisation. And that includes data from systems such as Forester, which is our forestry management system. We've got the central data store for us, which is our central GIS data store. So we've got everything in there from the access land, we've got picnic areas, play areas, etc. So they're the polygons we can bring in. Lines, we've got our public rights of ways, the national trails, waymark trails. Being in the data at the recreation planning team, the waymark trails data is sort of my baby, if you like, and I'm a complete control freak of it. So I think if you can make sure the data you're bringing in, especially from that point of view, is as top-notch as you can make it, it makes our lives easier in the long run. And then finally, looking at existing point data. So, for example, viewpoints, orienteering control posts, whether you've got things, other signage, trailheads, attribution signs, all that information that we possibly can bring in. Some of it may be digitised, some of it may not be. However, the process of bringing that data into this system means that you can also highlight those areas that perhaps a little bit more digitisation needs to go on from other maps that you've got elsewhere in the organisation. So we've gone along the lines of business data categorisation, and I'm not going to go through this in detail because you're probably all very familiar with it. But we've colour-coded the estate by the heavily, moderately, lightly developed and undeveloped. However, we've also put in a category called public rights of way only. So the reason we've done that is because there's slightly different management levels. And Dave and Graham, please correct me if I'm getting this inside out and back to front. So the lightly developed, say, linear features on the estate are things like our waymark trails or forest roads. However, if there's just a footpath that's going through a woodland, there's going to be a different level of management and safety structure on that linear feature. So we've highlighted those separately just to make sure we know. One other thing we've done just to help identify particular features on the estate is on the lightly developed waymarked trails, we've strung a yellow line over the top of it. So although it is a green category, you can tell where these the waymarked trails are to show where perhaps we'd have higher usage of those trails than we would in other areas. So, using the existing data sets we've got, we've automatically assigned the polygons of, say, visitor centres, cafes, highly populated or used trails as heavily developed, or ones that are hard tarmacked tracts. The moderately developed ones we automatically assigned car parks, play areas and picnic areas. Lightly developed, national trails, waymark trails, forest roads. you can start to see the picture building up of how this is all coming together as one layer on a GIS. And then finally the undeveloped, so the rest of the estate. So the woodlands, the rivers, the heathlands, the open moorland, mountain, whatever we've got really. But I'm sure you can imagine, one size really doesn't fit all. So, for example, you might have a play area like this, with wood chip on the floor, some rope work, but then you could have one that's directly outside the visitor centre, really highly used, got a lot of equipment, hard standing ground, and maybe that's heavily developed. For the moderately developed examples, okay, we put most car parks, all car parks as a standard, as moderately developed. What do you do with that? So this is one of our sites, which is the W National Nature Reserve and SLARS. This area that you can, little pointer, see here, expands all the way up there, and it's part of the estuary. So the sea is over here. And the car park, half of it inundates at high tides, depending on whether you've got a spring tide or a neap tide. And so how do you deal with that? That's a question that I'd quite like to have a discussion about with you guys afterwards to see how you go about changing that. Perhaps we have two different ones at different states of tide. And finally, heritage features. Generally, they're undeveloped. They're sitting there on the landscape. People perhaps don't visit them, but then we've also got heritage features where we've got interpretation. So people are drawn to them to go and see them. And we've had that up at Coed Brennan, I think, haven't we, Graham, with the mines. So maybe a different level of categorisation for those. So in GIS, I'm not going to steal Graham's thunder, so I'm not going to go over Newborough today, but I'm going to use Coed Brennan, partly because I can put their brains as well on the map for that. So Coed Brennan, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is the biggest mountain biking centre. Our biggest mountain. Yeah. So it's a beautiful site. If you get a chance to go, it's definitely worth a visit. You've got mountain biking, running, orienteering, walking trails, accessible trails, and there's tramp trails about as well. So it's a complete variety. So we applied that base map across the whole of the estate, zoomed in at Coed Brennan. And in order to make sure we've got this specific to sit aside Graham's risk assessment, we changed some of the colours. So for example, this here is a car park, and I've actually put in some outlines on them just to highlight what they are. Again, we don't have to do that, but I think it gives context to the maps. So we have done that on a lot of these, just to show what the features are and perhaps why we've categorised these certain things. We've got a picnic site down here, the visitor centre's in the turquoisey colour there, and as a general view, it kind of, as you get out further into the wider forest, it becomes more green and hatched than it does in the middle. These little blobs are orienteering markings, orienteering posts, sorry. However, there are some limitations to it, so I think it's just worth mentioning them really. So we have put on here a section for people to put notes in. So each of these maps, although they're in GIS, they can be exported as a PDF. And you can type in there if there's anything specific you want to highlight on that site. Also the disclaimer, so we put in there that the NRW Estate is zoned accordingly to the VSG risk categories, as illustrated on the map. However, these zones appear as hard boundaries, they're actually only indicative, and care has to be exercised if you're zooming in closely, as zones aren't sharply defined. So, in effect, it's a little bit like that. So, I haven't quite worked out how to do that on a map, but that's my next bit of research to see if I can get these polygons to merge into each other eventually, but for now we're going with the hard boundaries, but with the disclaimer to say if you zoom in, just because you stepped over where the line is on that map, it doesn't necessarily mean we've got nothing or lots. There's also, I put the date on the PDFs when they're printed, so they're only going to be accurate as of that date that they were printed. So for the GIS, if we want to continually update it, there is a possibility to do that. The final limitation I just wanted to chat about was dependent upon how you zoom in or what data sets you've got. you might find inconsistencies. So for example, this little bit here is different on the OS to here. This is actually a car park, and it's down here on the other map. So effectively, perhaps we need to extend our polygon to match that, but if you were to zoom out to 1 to 25,000, it might look fine. So it depends upon your scale and the accuracy of the data that you're inputting into the system as to what you get on the output. If you put rubbish in, you're going to get rubbish out. So there is the ability to edit it. So because we've used existing data, it's a set of polygons, lines, points already, and we can just highlight those particular ones, change the category if we say we want the car park to be heavily developed rather than lightly developed. Say this line coming out from the car park is tarmacked up until a certain point. Maybe that's going to be split off and changed to a different category again. You might find that we're just completely missing a feature and they've added a new boardwalk in. Perhaps we need to add that later on. But also, quite importantly, is to have the order trail of when this data was last checked. So an attribute within the data set itself shows what the category is, who signed it off, so who's relating it to their risk assessment, and the date in which that was done. So that's all for me. I'm going to hand over to Graham to go further into NRW.